The moving truck was still parked halfway in the driveway when the first police cruiser came screaming around the corner. By the time I set the box down, there were most threes of them, lights flashing red and blue across the calm lake like something out of a crime show. This was supposed to be a quiet first day in Cedar Ridge Shores, Missouri. Instead, I had officers stepping out with hands resting near their belts, asking who I was and why I was breaking into this house. According to them, the HOA president had called 911 to report suspicious individuals forcing entry. I didn't raise my voice. I handed over my keys, then my ID. Then the deed, still crisp from the attorney's office. I explained that the house belonged to my late uncle and that I was the legal owner. Across the street, as Evelyn Cross stood on her porch in pressed tennis whites, arms folded, watching like she'd already won. The officers barely glanced at my paperwork before turning back to her with polite nods and apologies. When they finally left, she crossed the street, leaned in close, and smiled. "You don't belong here," she whispered. "Cross me, and I'll make your life miserable." What she didn't know was that my uncle hadn't just left me a house. He left me the entire board she thought she ruled. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? My Uncle Harold Rourke was never a loud man. Growing up, I remember him as quiet, almost invisible at family gatherings, always sitting near the edge of the dock with a notebook instead of a beer. People in town called him odd. He wore old jackets, drove the same truck for decades, and spent more time studying the shoreline than talking to neighbors. But what most people didn't understand was that Harold was meticulous, obsessive even. He believed land mattered, water mattered, and once you gave power to the wrong people, they never gave it back willingly. When he passed, the lake house came to me. It wasn't just property. It was memory. Summers fishing off that dock. Mornings listening to loon's echo across the water. After everything I'd lost in the last few years, that house felt like a reset button, a place to breathe again. I wasn't trying to impress anyone in Cedar Ridge Shores. I just wanted peace. That was my first mistake. Cedar Ridge Shores looked perfect from the outside, every lawn trimmed to the same height, every mailbox identical. No kids riding bikes, no music, just silence. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful but watchful. People waved just enough to be polite, then looked away. Nobody lingered. Nobody talked. It didn't take long to realize this wasn't a community. It was a controlled environment. 3 days after I moved in, the first envelope appeared in my mailbox. Official. HOA letterhead stamped across the top. I opened it standing by the sink, still surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. Inside was a multi-page violation notice listing fines that made my stomach drop. Unauthorized vehicle parked in driveway. Non-approved landscaping along shoreline. Improper lake access usage. Each violation had a dollar amount next to it, plus administrative fees. The total was already more than a month's mortgage payment. What confused me most were the dates. Several fines were listed as occurring weeks earlier. One even went back months. I hadn't owned the house then. I hadn't even had keys. I assumed it was a clerical mistake. Surely someone would see that and fix it. I emailed the HOA office politely, attaching proof of ownership and move-in date. No response. I waited a day, then 2, then drove over in person. The office door was locked during posted hours. A printed sign said, "Email inquiries only." So I emailed again. Then again. Still nothing. By the end of the week, another envelope arrived. More violations, same tone, colder. This one warned that unpaid fines could result in liens against the property. That was when the anxiety kicked in. Not fear yet. More like disbelief. I had done everything right. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't broken any rules I knew of, and yet I was already being buried in paperwork. I started paying attention. The neighbor 2 houses down had an RV parked openly in his driveway. No citation. A boat sat uncovered on another lawn for days. No notice. Meanwhile, my old sedan was suddenly an unauthorized vehicle. Because it wasn't listed on some internal HOA form nobody had ever shown me. My uncle's native shoreline plants, which had been there for years, were labeled unapproved landscaping. The same plants the county conservation office had once praised him for. When I finally ran into an elderly woman walking her dog early one morning, I tried to ask about the HOA. Her name was Margaret. She glanced around before answering, like she was checking for cameras. "Don't fight her," she whispered. "It's easier if you just pay." I asked who "her" was, even though I already knew. She shook her head slowly. "She wins. One way or another." That was the moment I understood the real power structure. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. Evelyn Cross didn't need to shout or threaten publicly. She didn't need to show up herself. She ruled through letters, deadlines, and fear. Through the knowledge that most people would rather comply than risk losing their homes. I thought about my uncle then. About how careful he'd been. About all those notebooks. About the way he'd always said, "Read everything. Assume nothing." Standing there in my kitchen, surrounded by violation notices dated before I'd even arrived, I realized this wasn't random harassment. It was deliberate, calculated. Evelyn wasn't trying to correct behavior. She was testing me, seeing if I would fold like everyone else. And as I stacked the envelopes neatly on the counter instead of throwing them away, one thing became very clear. She had picked the wrong house. The fines stopped feeling accidental almost immediately. What started as a stack of paper turned into a daily ritual. Every morning, like clockwork, there was a new notice waiting in my mailbox. Same tone, same letterhead, slightly higher amounts each time. One day it was for my trash can being placed out too early. The next day it was for leaving it out too late. Then for a tire touching the edge of the driveway line. Then for condensation dripping from my air conditioning unit. Each notice came with an added administrative fee. As if the punishment wasn't the point so much as the pressure. A week later, I came home from the grocery store to find 2 people in reflective vests standing in my backyard with clipboards. No knock. No notice. Just an inspection. They measured my grass, took photos of my dock, and made notes about my shoreline plants like they were inventorying contraband. When I asked who authorized it, one of them shrugged and said, "Show a request." That was it. The next letter mentioned liens. Not as a threat, as a statement of procedure. Unpaid fines may result in legal action, including liens against the property. The language was calm, professional, and terrifying in its certainty. Evelyn didn't need to shout. She let the letterhead do it for her. What finally pushed me from confusion into anger was noticing what wasn't being enforced. The house across the cove hosted weekend parties with jet skis tied up overnight. No citations. A man 3 doors down kept a massive RV parked in plain view, violating at least 3 of the rules listed in my own notices. Nothing. Evelyn's inner circle waved at inspectors like they were old friends. Meanwhile, a single mother near the entrance quietly removed a flower bed after being fined into panic. An older couple sold their place and left within a month. I started to see the pattern. The rules weren't universal. They were weapons, aimed carefully and used selectively. Then came the lake notice. I found it taped to my door in bright red ink, like a warning label. Effective immediately. My kayak was banned from Cedar Ridge Shore's lake access due to safety concerns and unauthorized recreational equipment. I stared at the paper, then out at the water. The kayak was the same one my uncle had used for years. Quiet, non-motorized, Exactly the kind of thing the HOA claimed to encourage. Meanwhile, speedboats ripped across the lake daily, driven by people who shared wine nights with Evelyn. That night, I stopped assuming anything. I pulled the HOA bylaws from their website and printed them out. All of them. Page after page. I sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, reading every clause line by line. What I found was infuriating and strangely calming at the same time. Several of the rules being enforced against me simply did not exist. There was no language banning kayaks, no clause about non-approved sedans, no authority for retroactive fines, no provision allowing surprise inspections without notice. Evelyn wasn't enforcing policy. She was inventing it, counting on no one bothering to check. That was when I remembered my uncle's study. I hadn't gone in there yet. It still smelled like him. Old paper, lake water, something herbal I could never identify. When I finally opened the door, it was like stepping into a different version of him. Filing cabinets, labeled binders, handwritten notes tucked into folders, years of documentation, not just about the lake, but about the HOA meeting minutes. Correspondence, copies of violations issued to others, compared against ignored violations from the same dates. He had been watching them. The more I read, the clearer it became that this wasn't new. Evelyn had been doing this for years, targeting certain homeowners, pressuring them financially, forcing sales, clearing the shoreline of anyone who didn't fit her idea of community. My uncle hadn't fought her openly. He had documented her. The next HOA meeting was held in the clubhouse, and for the first time I attended. The room was full, but quiet. Too quiet. People stared at the floor or their phones. Evelyn stood at the front like a judge, calling items off the agenda without discussion. When my name came up, she read my violations aloud, slowly, with commentary. She joked about outsiders, not understanding standards. She suggested I educate myself before moving into a community like this. A few people laughed nervously. Most stayed silent. I tried to speak. She cut me off. Said comments were not permitted during enforcement proceedings. She reminded everyone that fines were non-negotiable. Then she moved on, like I was already dealt with. As I sat there, heat creeping up my neck, something shifted. The humiliation was intentional. The silence around me was trained. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had been scared into compliance before I arrived. When the meeting ended, Evelyn walked past me without slowing down. "Pay your fines," she said softly, "or leave." I watched her go, then looked around the room at the people who wouldn't meet my eyes. She thought she was breaking me. What she didn't realize was that she had just confirmed everything my uncle had been preparing me to see. I hadn't planned on opening my uncle's study that night. I'd walked past the door a dozen times since moving in, telling myself I'd get to it when things settled down. But nothing was settling. The fines were stacking up. The meetings were getting uglier, and the quiet threat in Evelyn's voice at the clubhouse still rang in my ears. So just after midnight, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was nothing like I expected. No clutter, no randomness. Everything had a place. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, each one filled with binders arranged by color and date. File cabinets sat against the far wall, their drawers labeled in my uncle's neat, deliberate handwriting. A large table dominated the center of the room, covered in maps, folders, and a single yellow legal pad with a note written across the top. Read everything. Assume nothing. I started with the binders. The first one was labeled HOA Financials. Inside were copies of budgets, invoices, and bank statements going back years. My uncle had highlighted discrepancies in red ink. Payments made without votes. Contracts renewed without bids. Consulting fees paid to companies with no clear purpose. Names repeated themselves over and over, always connected to Evelyn or people close to her. The next binder was worse. Selective enforcement. Page after page of violation notices issued to certain homeowners, paired with photographs of identical violations at other properties that had been ignored. Dates, times, addresses. My uncle hadn't just suspected wrongdoing. He had documented it like a prosecutor building a case. Then I opened the maps. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Lake outlines, parcel boundaries, dots in color, coded blocks along the shoreline. It took a moment to sink in. My uncle hadn't just lived here. He had been buying here, quietly, methodically, one property at a time. The binder labeled Rourke Holdings LLC confirmed it. He owned multiple lakefront homes. Some were rented back to longtime residents at below market rates. Others had been purchased after their owners were pressured with fines and assessments they couldn't afford. My uncle hadn't talked about it. He hadn't bragged. He had simply stepped in where people were being pushed out, protected them, and kept records of how it happened. I sat back in my chair and laughed once, sharp and breathless. Evelyn had no idea what she was standing on. The next morning, I filed a formal records request for the HOA's financial documents. Not an email, not a phone call. A certified letter citing the exact bylaw section that required compliance. I included a deadline. I copied my attorney. And I waited. Evelyn responded within hours. Her reply was cheerful, overly cheerful. She thanked me for my interest and transparency and assured me the board was reviewing the request. She reminded me that excessive demands could incur administrative costs. The message ended with a smiley face. It was confidence, but it felt thin, forced. Like someone trying to control a room that was slipping away. 2 days later, a black SUV appeared at the end of my driveway. Then another. Men in matching jackets stood near the road, radios clipped to their collars, eyes always on my house. No badges, no county markings, private security. When I asked one of them who hired them, he didn't answer directly, just said they were there for community safety. The invoice I later obtained told a different story. HOA funds, emergency authorization, no vote. Evelyn wasn't backing down. She was escalating. What she didn't expect was what happened next. The woman who lived next door knocked on my door that evening. She brought cookies and an apology. She said she hadn't wanted to get involved, but seeing security posted outside my home scared her. She told me about fines she'd paid quietly for years, about threats she'd received when she asked questions, about how her husband wanted to sell, but she couldn't bring herself to leave the lake. The next day, another neighbor stopped me by the dock. Then another, always quietly, always with the same glance over their shoulder first. They shared stories of surprise inspections, selective fines, and pressure campaigns that ended with for sale signs going up. Some had files of their own, receipts, letters, photos. They didn't know what to do with them before. Now they did. By the end of the week, my uncle's study wasn't just his anymore. It became a gathering place. One by one, people came in and added their pieces to the puzzle. What had once looked like isolated incidents turned into a pattern so clear it was impossible to deny. Evelyn noticed the shift. Her emails grew sharper. The security presence doubled. Another violation notice arrived, this one accusing me of hosting unauthorized meetings. I smiled when I read it, because I finally understood what my uncle had been doing all those years. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting for the moment when someone would be willing to finish what he started. Evelyn thought hiring security made her look powerful. She thought smiling emails showed confidence. But panic has a way of leaking through, no matter how carefully it's disguised. And now, for the first time since moving in, I felt it shift. Not in me, in her. By the time I decided to call an attorney, I already knew this wasn't something I could handle quietly on my own. Not because I lacked evidence, but because Evelyn was counting on exhaustion. She wanted me buried under paper, deadlines, and fear until I made a mistake. I needed someone who understood exactly how HOAs worked when they crossed the line. That's how I found Rachel Kim. Rachel didn't blink when I laid everything out on her conference table. The violation notices, the inspection photos, the security invoices, the binders from my uncle's study. She didn't interrupt. She didn't nod sympathetically. She just listened, flipping pages with a precision that reminded me of my uncle. When I finished, she leaned back and said something that changed the temperature of the room instantly. "Do you know when Evelyn Cross was last legally elected?" I told her I assumed it had been the previous year. Rachel shook her head and slid a document toward me. According to the HOA's own bylaws, elections were required annually. The last recorded vote had happened years ago, quietly, extended by board approval. No homeowner vote, no quorum, no authority. Her term expired, Rachel said calmly. Everything she's done since then is legally questionable. Some of it is outright personal liability. That word stuck with me. Personal, not shared. Hers. Rachel went through the list methodically. Retroactive fines, unauthorized inspections, hiring private security without a vote, threatening liens without due process. Each item carried risk. Together, they formed something much worse. Evelyn hadn't just overreached. She'd built a habit of acting alone and daring no one to challenge her. We didn't rush to file anything. Rachel stopped me when I suggested it. "No," she said. "Not yet. Right now, she thinks she's winning. That's your advantage." The plan was simple and brutal in its patience. Let Evelyn keep escalating. Let her issue more fines. Let her send more emails. Let her dig deeper. We would document everything. Every notice, every inspection, every unauthorized action. The longer she went unchecked, the stronger the case became. The goal wasn't to scare her into stopping. It was to let her prove who she really was. At the same time, Rachel quietly reached out to a local investigative reporter she trusted. Nothing public, no accusations. Just a heads up that something was unfolding in Cedar Ridge shores that might be worth watching. The reporter asked for documents. We gave her a few, enough to raise eyebrows, not enough to tip our hand. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Rachel asked me to bring in the property documents related to my uncle's LLC. When I spread them out on the table, even she paused. The LLC didn't just own homes. It controlled easements, dock access, shoreline rights, boat launches, quietly, legally. My uncle had positioned himself as the gatekeeper of the very lake Evelyn claimed to protect. "She doesn't know this," Rachel said. I replied, "She doesn't." That was the real advantage. Evelyn believed she controlled the community because she controlled the HOA paperwork. She didn't understand land, or rights, or long-term strategy. My uncle had never challenged her publicly because he didn't need to. He had been building leverage while she collected fines. From that point on, I changed my behavior completely. I stopped reacting. When another violation notice arrived, I logged it and filed it away. When security photographed my dock, I waved and documented the time. When Evelyn sent an email dripping with confidence and thinly veiled threats, I replied politely, thanking her for the update. No arguments, no accusations, just calm acknowledgement. It drove her crazy. Her emails became longer, sharper. She reminded me repeatedly of potential liens. She CC'd board members who didn't exist anymore. She warned me that continued noncompliance would force further action. I could feel her urgency through the screen. The harder she pushed, the more obvious it became that she needed me to react. Meanwhile, the reporter asked more questions. Neighbors started sharing stories with her too, quietly, carefully. Nothing hit the news yet, but the pressure was building. Evelyn didn't see any of that. All she saw was a homeowner who refused to break, who didn't yell, who didn't leave, who didn't pay. She mistook my calm for weakness. In reality, it was discipline. Every day she escalated, she added another brick to the wall that was going to come down on her. Every unauthorized decision tightened the net, and every smile she wore while threatening me told me one thing for certain. She still thought she was in control. I let her keep believing it. Because the moment someone like Evelyn realizes they're losing is the moment they stop making mistakes. And I needed her to make just a few more. The word emergency showed up in everyone's mailbox on the same morning. Thick envelopes, bold lettering, urgent tone. Evelyn announced an immediate special assessment to cover critical infrastructure repairs that could not be delayed. No itemized list, no bids, no explanation beyond vague references to safety and liability. Each homeowner was given a short deadline and a clear warning: failure to pay would result in fines, interest, and potential liens. Panic spread fast. I watched it happen in real time. Neighbors stood in driveways comparing letters, voices tight, hands shaking. Retirees whispered about fixed incomes. Young families talked about draining savings. For years, most of them had paid whatever Evelyn demanded because it felt safer than resisting. But this time, something was different. The amount was too high, the explanation too thin, and my refusal to crumble had started to chip away at the fear. A few people pushed back publicly. They asked for invoices. They asked for votes. They asked why this was suddenly urgent. Evelyn responded the way she always did, with certainty and pressure. She told them the board had already approved it. She reminded them of their obligations. She implied that questioning leadership during a crisis was irresponsible. When that didn't work, she changed tactics. She started knocking on doors, not to answer questions, but to tell stories. According to her, I wasn't just a problem homeowner, I was a threat. A developer plant, someone sent to destabilize the community so outside investors could swoop in and buy cheap. She warned people that resisting the assessment would help my agenda. She used words like takeover and displacement. She played on every fear she could reach. Some people believed her, most didn't. Too many had their own experiences now. Too many had receipts. The lies didn't land the way they used to. That was when the security presence escalated again. One afternoon, while I was out, two of them walked past the posted boundary markers on my shoreline and onto my dock. They photographed equipment. They opened storage bins. One of them even tried the door to my boathouse. When I confronted them later with the footage, they claimed it was a misunderstanding. Routine patrol, community safety. Rachel didn't laugh when she saw the video. "That's trespass," she said, "and they billed the HOA for it." 2 days later, a manila envelope appeared taped to my front door. The paper inside was styled to look official. Heavy legal language, court formatting. It claimed that I was in violation of community covenants and ordered to vacate the property pending enforcement action. It cited statutes that didn't apply. It referenced a court that hadn't issued anything. It was a fake eviction notice. Evelyn had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. This wasn't intimidation anymore. It was impersonation, fraud, an attempt to force me out using fabricated authority. When neighbors saw the notice, the emotional temperature shifted. Fear turned into anger. People who had stayed neutral started asking hard questions. Some took photos. Some called lawyers of their own. The stakes were no longer abstract. This was about homes, savings, safety, dignity. Evelyn felt it slipping. I could see it in her messages. The emails became frantic, stuffed with legal jargon and reminders of consequences. She accused me of harassment. She accused neighbors of collusion. She accused anyone who questioned her of undermining the community. Power, once challenged, doesn't fade quietly. It lashes out. Then she made her biggest move. A mandatory HOA meeting was announced. Attendance required. Failure to appear subject to fines. The notice promised full transparency and final resolutions. I knew exactly what she was planning. She wanted a public show of control. A stage. A chance to reassert authority, paint herself as the only thing standing between order and chaos. Rachel read the notice and nodded slowly. "She's panicking," she said. "This is where people make mistakes." In the days leading up to the meeting, my uncle's study filled up again. Neighbors came with folders, USB drives, females, bank statements, stories poured out that had been buried for years. Together, they formed a picture so clear it was almost overwhelming. I didn't sleep much that week, not because I was afraid, but because the weight of it all finally hit me. This wasn't just about standing up to one person. It was about undoing years of quiet harm, about choosing not to look away anymore. On the night before the meeting, I walked down to the dock and looked out over the water. The lake was still, unbothered by the chaos around it. I thought about my uncle, about patience, about preparation. Evelyn believed the meeting would end this. She was right, just not in the way she thought. The community center had never been that full. Cars lined both sides of the road, spilling into the grass like a festival instead of an HOA meeting. Inside, every folding chair was taken. People stood along the walls. I recognized faces I'd never seen at meetings before, neighbors who had stayed quiet for years but had finally decided to show up. Near the back, a local news camera was setting up. A few county officials stood together, not speaking, just watching. The air felt tight, like everyone knew something was about to snap. Evelyn arrived last. She walked and dressed sharply, chin high, carrying a thick binder and a laptop like armor. She smiled as she took her place at the front, waiting for the room to settle. When she began to speak, her voice was calm and rehearsed, the tone of someone used to being obeyed. She clicked through charts showing rising costs, alleged safety concerns, and supposed violations tied back to me. She talked about instability, about bad actors, about how one homeowner had disrupted years of harmony. Every slide pointed in the same direction. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. This was her theater. I sat quietly in the second row. She asked if I wanted to respond. I shook my head. That seemed to please her. She took my silence as defeat and leaned into it, finishing with a warning about what would happen if leadership was undermined. She closed her binder and smiled again, like the matter was settled. That was when I stood. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I just asked if I could show the room something. She hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Denying me would have looked bad with cameras rolling. The first document went up on the screen, a property ownership map of Cedar Ridge shores. Color-coded. Labeled. I explained, calmly, that my late uncle's limited liability company owned not just my home, but multiple lakefront properties. Gasps rippled through the room as addresses appeared, some belonging to people sitting there. I clarified that many of those homeowners were renting back at below market rates, protected. Evelyn's smile stiffened. Next came the contracts. Landscaping, mailboxes, security, consulting services. I showed how the same names kept appearing, how companies were tied back to Evelyn's relatives and close associates. I didn't call it corruption. I didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Inflated invoices, no competitive bids. Payments approved without votes. Then the footage played. Security guards on my dock. Opening my storage bins. Trying my boathouse door. The timestamp and billing invoice appeared side by side. Unauthorized trespass. Paid for with HOA funds. Someone in the back muttered something loud enough for the microphone to catch. That was when the county tax assessor stepped forward. She hadn't spoken all night. She didn't raise her voice now. She simply addressed Evelyn directly and served her with a notice for unpaid back taxes tied to unreported income. Consulting fees. Years' worth. The room went dead silent. Evelyn stared at the paper like it was written in another language. Before she could speak, the reporter raised her hand. She asked a single question: whether Evelyn had been receiving monthly payments from a development company interested in acquiring lakefront land. She named the company. She asked if that explained the forced sales, the emergency assessments, the pressure. Evelyn lost control. She started shouting, accused me of conspiracy, accused the room of betrayal. She insisted she was in charge, that she had authority, that none of this was legal. Her voice cracked, then rose again, louder, frantic. The camera didn't look away. Neither did the county officials. One of them stepped forward and told her to stop. Another asked her to sit down. She refused. That was when it ended. Not with shouting, not with drama, with paperwork. With officers moving calmly to the front. With documented evidence laid out in plain sight. With authority she could not bully or invent. Evelyn was escorted out of the room. She had ruled for years, still arguing, still insisting this wasn't over. But it was. The meeting dissolved into stunned conversation. People hugged. Some cried. Others just sat there shaking. The reporter kept filming. The officials stayed, answering questions. The power Evelyn had wielded collapsed in a single evening, not because someone got lucky, but because the truth had been allowed to speak uninterrupted. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relief. For the first time since moving in, the room felt lighter, like something heavy had finally been lifted off everyone's shoulders. And as I watched the doors close behind Evelyn, I thought about my uncle again. He hadn't needed to win loudly. He'd just needed to wait for the moment when the evidence could no longer be ignored. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It moved the way real consequences do, quietly at first, then all at once, then permanently. Within days of that meeting, Evelyn was formally removed from her position. Not suspended, not on leave. Removed. The language mattered. And for the first time it was being used correctly. Charges followed soon after, not theatrical or exaggerated, but precise and unavoidable. Financial misconduct, fraudulent notices, unauthorized use of funds, things she could no longer explain away with confidence or intimidation. An independent audit firm was brought in to examine the HOA's finances. Boxes were carried out of the office, hard drives copied, emails recovered. What they found confirmed everything my uncle had documented and more. Years of self-dealing, inflated contracts, payments approved without votes, emergency assessments that were never emergencies. The numbers were so bad the auditors didn't bother softening their conclusions. The HOA hadn't been mismanaged. It had been exploited. Letters went out to homeowners shortly after. Not violation notices this time. Refund notices. Every illegal fine was returned with interest. Some people cried when they opened those envelopes. One couple told me they were finally able to fix their roof. Another said they could stop working extra shifts. Mrs. Patterson, who had nearly lost her home years earlier, hugged me so tightly I thought she might fall over. For the first time in a long while, money flowed back into the community instead of out of it. The private security contracts were canceled immediately. The black SUVs disappeared from the road overnight. No radios crackling, no strangers watching from the curb. Just quiet, real quiet. The kind that doesn't feel like surveillance. The lake felt different without them, more open, less tense. An interim board was formed, not from volunteers eager for power, but from residents who had already proven they cared. People who had been fined unfairly. People who had stayed when it would have been easier to leave. Meetings were recorded. Financials posted publicly. Questions welcomed instead of punished. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Lake access was restored under clear, written rules that actually existed. Kayaks returned. Docks reopened. Families came back down to the water. Kids fished off the pier again. One morning, I saw a man teaching his daughter how to paddle, both of them laughing like they hadn't realized how much they'd missed it until it was back. A month later, the county hosted a small ceremony by the shoreline. Nothing flashy, just a few speeches and a plaque. My uncle's name was etched into it, recognizing his work preserving the native plants and shoreline habitats. Officials talked about sustainability, about stewardship, about doing things quietly and correctly. I stood there listening, thinking about how strange it was that the man so many people had dismissed as boring had been the reason this place survived at all. The community changed in ways that were harder to measure. People lingered outside longer. Conversations didn't stop when someone new walked by. For sale signs came down. Gardens returned. There was laughter where there had only been careful silence before. One evening, a group of neighbors gathered on my dock without asking permission. Someone brought food. Someone else brought music. We watched the sun drop behind the trees and talked about nothing important at all. It felt like something had reset, like a weight had been removed, that none of us realized we were carrying until it was gone. Evelyn was no longer part of the conversation. Not because she'd been erased, but because she no longer mattered. Her power had depended entirely on fear and silence. Once those were gone, there was nothing left to hold on to. Standing there by the water, I finally understood what my uncle had been protecting. Not land, not property, people. And now, for the first time since I'd arrived, Cedar Ridge shores felt like a place worth belonging to. The morning after everything finally settled, the lake was perfectly still. No patrol boats, no clipboards, no envelopes waiting in the mailbox. Just water stretching out in front of the dock, reflecting the sky the way it always had, long before any of us argued over it. I sat there with a cup of coffee and listened to the quiet, the real kind, and thought about how easily power can grow when no one questions it. For years, people had been controlled by paper, by official-looking letters, by the fear of losing what they'd worked their entire lives to build. Evelyn didn't need to shout or threaten most of the time. She just needed people to stay silent, and silence, I learned, is what lets bullies thrive. Not strength, not authority, just the belief that no one will push back. My uncle understood that. His real legacy wasn't the houses or the lake access or the documents locked away in his study. It was preparation. He knew that truth only matters if it's preserved, organized, and ready when the moment comes. He didn't fight loudly. He waited, and he left the tools behind for someone else to finish the job. That weekend, the community held a barbecue by the water. Kids ran along the shore. Neighbors who had barely nodded at each other before sat together laughing. The fear that once kept everyone apart had been replaced by something simple and rare: trust. As the sun set over the lake, I realized something important. Standing up doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like patience, documentation, and refusing to be bullied into silence. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?